a major crash in the financial system. Most of the investment banks are bankrupt, and many of the commercial banks are bankrupt.
With unemployment in the double digits, millions have lost their homes.
The breadth and depth of this recession, that states are dealing with problems that are pretty unprecedented.
I mean, does anybody think it's over? Anybody raise your hand if you think it's over?
It's fairly simple. 9/11 became the excuse to invade Afghanistan. Then the Bush administration convinced us that who we really needed to invade was Iraq. These wars cost lots of money. Where'd we get the money? Mostly by borrowing it. In other words, by selling U.S. Treasury notes and bonds, or by simply creating new money. This drives the value of the dollar down. There is a common misconception about inflation. Most anyone will tell you it is the rising of prices. Rising prices are in fact the result of inflation, inflation being simply an increase in the money supply. The more dollars you print, the less they are worth. During Bush's 2 terms, the Federal Reserve increased the money supply in the U.S. by a whopping 50%, and under Obama they've doubled it again. In the decade leading up to the economic crisis, the Federal Reserve and outfits like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac encouraged easy lending policies. The Fed dropped interest rates down to 1%, while the government practically forced banks to make dodgy home loans. This drove home prices up. Lenders bundled these loans and sold them to investors who hedged against potential losses using derivatives, a sort of insurance. This derivatives market grew, by most estimates, into the hundreds of trillions. All the while, American manufacturing jobs had been moving to China, leaving the U.S. with a consumer-based economy based more and more on borrowing and inflation than actual production. With war costs added in, this is a giant house of cards. All that had to happen was for housing prices to slip. Who got us into this mess? Well, the people that run the government, of course. No, not those people. These people.
Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz.
L. Frank Baum's books about the Land of Oz were published between the years 1900 and 1920. It is widely accepted that his children's books were a veiled commentary on the politics of the day, and that the man behind the curtain was an allegory for the robber barons who created the Federal Reserve.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The great and Oz has spoken.
Who are you?
Who indeed? The theft of American economic sovereignty by the Federal Reserve, which is not a government agency but rather a cartel set up by private bankers, can really only be understood by going back to the time of the American Revolution. It is widely taught in schools that the causes which drove Americans to split from Britain were taxes on tea, forced quartering of troops, and similar abuses. This is misleading. Before America declared its independence, Parliament had banned the issuance of bills of credit in the colonies with the Currency Act of 1764. This made colonial scrip illegal. In other words, England told America, you can't print your own money. Benjamin Franklin believed that this was among the primary causes of the American Revolution, something which he tried to explain to England's Parliament. Founders like Jefferson, Franklin, and Madison were strongly opposed to the establishment of a central bank, knowing that it would open the door to foreign and private interests seizing control over America's currency. Jefferson wrote, I sincerely believe that banking institutions are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity is but swindling futurity on a large scale. This is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the delegate from New York whose moneyed elite he represented. Hamilton supported friendly relations with England and fought to establish a central bank. Many of the founders opposed him on this, as did southern states like Virginia and Maryland. Hamilton's proposal involved the assumption of states' debts by the federal government, which would be offset by new taxes. Virginia and Maryland had already paid off much of their war debt and didn't want to have to pay twice. There was another hot debate going on at the time, where to put the nation's capital. New York and Philadelphia were popular candidates in the North, but some founders were wary of placing the capital in either of these financial centers where corruption between bankers and politicians could take root. Finally, a compromise was reached. States' debts would be centralized under a federal bank, and in return, the capital would be established on the Potomac River. Hamilton showed his true colors when he was discovered by then-President Adams planning a coup d'etat against the fledgling U.S. government. Despite this little-known fact, Hamilton's face graces the U.S. $10 bill to this day. In the end, Hamilton was shot dead by Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, in a duel over a private dispute. But his supporters, the moneylenders of New England and Great Britain, got their bank. The charter for the First National Bank of the United States was due to run out in 1812. Congress refused to renew the charter. Almost immediately, war between America and Britain broke out. Many causes are given for the War of 1812, but anger over the elimination of the First National Bank, which British bankers held a major stake in, is never mentioned. On the other side of the Atlantic, German banker Mayer Amschel Rothschild and his sons were quickly becoming a banking powerhouse across Europe and England. His eldest son Amschel in Frankfurt, Salomon in Vienna, Nathan in London, Karl in Naples, and James in Paris. Frederick Morton writes, "The history of the House of Rothschild has been to an amazing degree the backstage history of Western Europe, because of their success in making loans not to individuals, but to nations." Napoleon was terrorizing Europe at the time, and Nathan and James, by far the most successful of the Rothschild sons, reaped huge profits by financing both sides of the war. They maintained a sophisticated intelligence network to stay ahead of the news, and when Napoleon finally lost to Wellington, Nathan had spies posted behind the lines at Waterloo, as well as a courier ready to race back to England when the outcome became known. When Nathan heard of Napoleon's defeat, he began selling government bonds, or consols as they were known, hand over fist. Seeing this, the other traders were duped into thinking that Wellington had lost, and a panic ensued. After stocks and bonds had nosedived to a fraction of their price, Baron Rothschild began buying them up again. When the official news of Wellington's victory reached London, prices shot back up. It is said the Baron multiplied his already substantial fortune 20 times over that day. Some, such as Richard Lewinson in his 1937 book The Profits of War, have claimed that Baron Rothschild gained control of the Bank of England at this time. It is impossible to know for sure how much Nathan made, or what the family is worth, or even what companies they control to any degree of certainty, for the Rothschilds have always kept such information secret. But there is no doubt that they are, and have been for the last 2 centuries, by far the wealthiest family in the world. The War of 1812 had left America's financial house in shambles, so much so that then-President Madison was persuaded to allow a second central bank to be established. It might be a good idea to look at what was going on behind the scenes at this point. The 2 richest men in America at the time were Stephen Girard and John Jacob Astor. The Astor family is best known for its real estate, but John Jacob made his fortune first in fur trading and opium. Girard looks like he could use a hat. In current U.S. dollars, these men would have been twice as wealthy as Bill Gates. Girard and Astor both held large shares in Hamilton's First National Bank of the U.S., and after it was shut down, the 2 men used their influence to promote Alexander Dallas to the post of Treasury Secretary. Dallas used his position to push through a new central bank, which Girard and Astor would be major stockholders in as well. The Second National Bank of the U.S. would not last any longer than the first, however, for in the election of 1828, war hero Andrew Jackson ran on an anti-bank platform and won. As president, addressing a delegation of bankers, he famously said, "You are a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to rout you out, and by the grace of the eternal God, I will rout you out." When Congress approved a bill to recharter the bank in 1832, Jackson vetoed it. Why all the fuss? Why were men like Jackson and Jefferson so opposed to a central bank? Because the ability to control the currency of a nation is the ability to control the nation itself. In the words of James Garfield, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." It is easy to see the danger inherent in this power falling into private hands when one realizes that with it comes the ability to create booms and busts at will. The present crisis was intended. Insider Richard C. Cook goes so far as to say, "They did it on purpose. The housing bubble and its crash were engineered from the highest levels of the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, and the financial industry." As for the crash of 1929, Ben Bernanke himself spilled the beans at a banquet in 2002. It is doubtful that the private owners of the Fed were ever sorry, however. These booms and busts over the years have all been precipitated for a reason: to redistribute wealth. During booms, wealth gravitates upward due to inflation.
Even before a currency collapses, the damage done by a fiat system is significant. Our monetary system insidiously transfers wealth from the poor and the middle class to the privileged rich. Those who benefit the most are the ones who get to use the newly created credit first.
And following crashes, the most powerful companies snatch up assets and competitors for nickels on the dollar.
Lehman Brothers has filed for bankruptcy.
Wells Fargo will become the largest U.S. bank by branches with an $11.7 billion offer for rival Wachovia.
Merrill Lynch, the world's biggest brokerage, has been bought by Bank of America.
Washington Mutual has gone under. The FDIC then turned around and sold WAMU's thrift banking assets to J.P. Morgan Chase.
This hat trick has been repeated by the world's top businessmen so many times, it is a wonder that booms and busts are universally perceived as unintended. But the truth of the matter is, nearly every economic crisis in American history has been engineered, and there have been many. Two factors contributed to the Rothschild banking family's success. One was their ability to take advantage of financial panics. Maybe more significant was their talent for creating alliances. John Jacob Astor employed an agent, Jacob B. Taylor, to make his real estate deals in order to conceal his identity. Nathan Rothschild and his son Lionel used the same tact. In fact, their American agent during this period was Taylor's own son, Moses. After Jackson shut down the Second National Bank, the National City Bank of New York grew to prominence. Moses Taylor, with Rothschild backing and by buying up shares during the panics of 1837 and 1857, took it over. Reorganized from the ashes of Hamilton's First National Bank in 1812, National City's list of presidents, directors, and stockholders over the years is a veritable who's who of American finance. It was the first and primary investor bank in the Federal Reserve and remains one of America's biggest banks to this day, albeit under a slightly different name. A 1976 congressional report identified 3 Rothschild subsidiaries in the U.S., the National City Bank of Cleveland, the First City Bank of Houston, and the First National Bank of Seattle. Allegedly, the word city in the names of these banks is a reference to the city. The city is the financial district located in the center of London. Sometimes called the Square Mile, it is actually a sovereign state much like the Vatican and maintains its own police force. The city has been the center of world banking since the days of the Western world's first multinational bankers, the Knights Templar. 800 years ago, the Templar Knights built the Crown Temple Church there and made it their home, and England's financial and legal institutions grew up around it. You can find the Templar Knights' familiar red cross on the city's coat of arms. For that matter, the Cross of St. George, as it is known, is also a part of the British flag. The city is